Imagine a black, tarred box, wider than a house and longer than a city block, rolling on a world of water. Inside that box, the groans of timber blend with the cries of thousands of living creatures. The air grows thick with heat, moisture, and the sharp tang of pitch. One tiny slot at the top offers the only promise of fresh air. Was this simply a miracle carried out in divine hands, or was it also a masterclass in hard, practical survival engineering? The answer is surprising. The Ark, as described in the text, reads like a purpose-built survival system, an architected response to a planet-sized catastrophe, even while the story insists on God's decisive intervention at key moments. At the heart of this reconstruction is a basic claim. The biblical details are not random. Words like kinim and tsoar, proportions given in cubits, and the insistence on decks and a sealed threshold hint at purposeful choices. What follows is not certainty. It is a plausible, technically informed reconstruction consistent with the text. An attempt to imagine how carpentry, passive physics, and disciplined human labor could have combined with divine providence to keep life alive on that floating laboratory. If this is making you rethink the Ark, comment, "It was more than a boat." Start by picturing the Ark's silhouette. The Bible gives proportions, length to width at roughly 6 poin. That ratio transforms the vessel from a sleek ship into a giant floating box. Modern naval architecture calls that form barge-like. It sacrifices speed and steerability for passive stability. A long, relatively narrow box resists capsizing by producing a steady roll rather than violent flipping. Waves lift and set the hull without the complex dynamics of a keel-driven sailing craft. In other words, this is not a ship meant to race or tack. It is a refuge designed to ride out enormous forces with the greatest chance of staying upright. But that box shape creates its own problem: longitudinal stress. Imagine the Ark riding a massive crest at bow and stern while the center spans a trough, or conversely, the middle forced up with bow and stern supported. Structural engineers call this bending, hogging, and sagging. Left unchecked, a wooden hull of that size could fracture along its length. The biblical specification of 3 decks is likely not decorative. Those decks serve as longitudinal ties, internal beams spanning the width and connecting sides, that turn the Ark's interior into a triangulated, reinforced framework. The decks act like the cross-bracing in a bridge, or the ribs in a giant box girder, converting many independent planks into a single load-sharing unit. This doesn't eliminate the risk, but it changes a fragile plank raft into a monolithic, resilient hull capable of resisting the stresses of global waves. Next, consider the Ark's outer skin. The text makes clear that Noah coated the Ark with pitch, bitumen, inside and out. Bitumen is an ancient waterproofing, sticky, black, impermeable. It gives the hull the look and some of the properties of a coffin, a sealed shell. That pitch would have been life-saving by keeping salt water out and fresh interior spaces dry, but it would also transform the Ark's internal environment. Bitumen absorbs heat and radiates a constant, dry odor. The interior would be darker and warmer than a bare wooden hold. Pitch exposed to heat can off-gas volatile organic compounds. Even without modern toxicology labels, it's reasonable to suppose the Ark smelled of tar and steam whenever animals raised the temperature. That sensory environment, hot, smelly, dim, would amplify stress. Sound compounds that stress. A wooden box that size is an extraordinary acoustic amplifier. Think of a giant violin or a closed auditorium where every roar bounces and builds. Predators growl, birds shriek, hooves stamp. In a confined, resonant space, those sounds become an unrelenting, amplified assault. Acoustically, small closed compartments behave better. They break the sound field into many small, damp chambers rather than one enormous echo chamber. This is where the Hebrew term kinim becomes significant. Kinim, often translated as nests or compartments, suggests that the ark's interior was subdivided into many small enclosures. That single word is a clue. Small, segregated spaces reduce the chance of injury during pitching, limit contagion, and, crucially, dampen the resonant amplification that a single open hold would produce. In practical terms, kinim are likely to have been partitions or stalls, where each kind found a contained space with bedding to absorb sound and anchor animals against sudden shifts. Those partitions also serve biological ends. Confined animals move less, their metabolism follows. Activity costs calories. An animal that cannot roam conserves energy. While we should not overstate the effect, a cow kept standing still does not reduce its basal metabolic rate to a fraction of normal. Enforced calm lowers food demand compared to a panicked stampede. The darkened, quiet niches would have encouraged rest, limited injury from fighting and free movement, and made rationing feasible. In a closed, resource-limited situation, every measure that reduces unnecessary exertion is a survival advantage. But reduced movement and sealed pitch together pose one of the ark's most acute dangers: air quality. Thousands of animals produce heat, moisture, carbon dioxide, and gases from decomposition and manure, methane and ammonia among them. Without ventilation, CO2 can reach levels that cause headaches, cognitive impairment, and, at extremes, loss of consciousness. Methane, while a lesser physiological toxin, is explosive in the right concentration. Ammonia irritates the respiratory tract. Building a floating ark that remained breathable for months required an elegant solution that preserved waterproofing, a continuous, high-level opening that functioned as a kind of nostril. The Hebrew word soar refers to an opening or a sealable aperture near the top. Interpreted functionally, a soar placed at roof level becomes a vent slot. Here is where passive physics shines. Passive ventilation works on the chimney effect. Warm air rises. The heat generated by animals and human occupants causes air to warm, expand, and ascend toward the highest point, the tsoar. As warm, CO2-enriched air exits through that upper opening, it draws in cooler, fresher air through controlled lower openings or porous seams, creating a gentle exchange that does not admit waves. This is elegant because it relies on temperature gradients rather than mechanical pumps. The tsoar must be high and narrow enough to let hot air escape and yet shielded against driving rain. A continuous slot under a protected overhang, think of a guarded clerestory, could do just that, offering the ark a passive breathing mechanism that is consistent with the sparse textual detail. A critical risk here is explosive gas accumulation. Methane from manure is flammable between roughly 5% and 15% volume in air. Enclosed spaces with poor ventilation and open flames, for cooking, lighting, or warmth, are dangerous. It is plausible that Noah's household minimized open flames below decks, used lights sparingly and above the tsoar, and planned food preparation in the safest zones. Even so, the sealing of the ark, God shut him in, escalates these hazards. At the moment the door is sealed, the ark is more hermetic than ever, and anything that could cause ignition would be catastrophic. That theological detail aligns with a technical interpretation. A divine act sealed a structural vulnerability that humans, by themselves, would struggle to close reliably in heavy seas. Weight distribution becomes the next puzzle. The ark carries a vast range of masses: small birds, large herbivores, heavy mammals like elephants or rhinoceroses, stores of grain and water, and the human family tasked with care. Naval architects talk about center of gravity, CG, and center of buoyancy. To remain stable, the CG must be relatively low. The lower you place heavy weights, the more you resist capsizing moments. The Ark's design, therefore, likely placed the heaviest live loads on the lowest deck, a living ballast or lastro vivo. Large herbivores and bulky animals would have been secured in the lower level to lower the overall center of gravity. Lighter animals and human quarters would sit above. This arrangement creates a self-righting tendency. If waves tilt the hull, the low-placed mass tends to restore equilibrium. Load distribution also addresses longitudinal balance. Not only must fore and aft weights be balanced to avoid pitch-induced stress, but heavy animals or stores must be fixed so that shifting does not create a weight transfer. Consider a stampeding mass moving toward the stern as the ship pitches. That shift could produce a critical imbalance. Effective restraint systems, pens firmly bolted to deck beams, bedding packed to reduce sliding, and internal bulkheads would have been essential. The kinim, again, help. Many small pens prevent mass movement and localize any weight transfer. Feeding this menagerie is a logistical challenge that demands engineering creativity. You cannot feed thousands of animals efficiently if every ration requires descending stairways and manual carriage. The Ark's three-deck plan supports a gravity-fed system. The top deck, kept dry and reserved for storage, could serve as a grain and fodder silo area. Granaries in the ancient Near East were often simple bins, sealed against moisture and pests with bitumen. Imagine sealed amphorae and bins stacked and organized above a network of chutes and hoppers. Grain, hay, and dried meat could be released through simple wooden gates into chutes that guided feed down to the pens below. One human family could manage distribution by opening and closing hatches according to a strict schedule. This is not mechanization. It's simple gravity and clever layout, reducing labor and reaction time during storms. Predators present a thornier problem. Carnivores require meat, and some species cannot thrive for long on plant substitutes. The Ark may have kept predators in isolated kinim, where their activity and feeding were tightly controlled. Preserved meat, salted, dried, or frozen by cold temperature in shaded, ventilated compartments, could provide rationed portions. Another possibility is that predators were kept calm and sedate by stocking them in small enclosures with minimal stimuli and reduced movement. Conservation of energy limits the need for food. The record does not mandate either approach. Both are plausible and consistent, with an emphasis on planning, discipline, and trade-offs. Sanitation was arguably the Ark's least glamorous yet most critical engineering problem. Manure, urine, carcasses, and waste fluids are biological hazards. They produce ammonia and hydrogen sulfide, house pathogenic microbes, and draw flies. The solution likely combined passive and mechanical elements, slatted floors, inclined chutes, and the use of the ocean's motion as a cleaning agent. Slatted floors allow liquids and solids to pass through into collection channels below. Those channels could be arranged with a slight incline toward discharge points, where, during appropriate sea conditions, the motion of the waves helps sweep waste away. The Ark's hull, coated in pitch, could include outflow scuppers at low deck lines designed to allow liquid to leave without admitting seawater during normal rolling. This is not a pump. It is controlled gravity drainage timed with sea state, much like how a modern barge uses bilge arrangements and scuppers. But passive waste removal is not foolproof. Smells would have accumulated, and pathogen control depends on drying and ventilation. Here again, the tsoar and the kinim collaborate. Elevated vents remove moist air and gases, while compartmentalization isolates infection and keeps maintenance crews from being overwhelmed. Daily routines would include scraping, cleaning, ash application, or lime, if available, to buffer odors, and removal of major accumulations during calmer conditions. The human family would be indispensable. The Ark is not a passive system that works alone. Discipline, scheduled feeding, cleaning, and health checks becomes as important as any architectural feature. Water supply is surprisingly straightforward in principle. The Ark's roof is a vast catchment surface. A prolonged global rainfall provides an enormous volume of fresh water that can be collected and stored. Simple channels and gutters could guide rain into cisterns or large sealed vats. Bitumen-sealed cisterns and amphorae are ancient technology. The Ark most likely used cisterns placed high in the hull so that water could be distributed by gravity through pipes or simple stopcocks to where it was needed. Placing fresh water high also protects it from contamination by waste that might lie lower. Collected rainwater reduces dependence on scarce potable sources and, together with rationing, makes long-term survival feasible. Beyond the hardware, there is a human hardware, psychology and routine. Months of confinement, constant noise, malodors and darkness take a psychological toll. Limiting sensory overload becomes part of the Ark's design. The single opening at the top, the tsoar, offers light and the only consistent view outward. That limited visual input muffles the trauma of seeing a drowned world and may have reduced panic among both animals and humans. For the human crew, the lack of external stimuli increases stress. Yet the same lack of stimuli can also steady purpose if shaped into ritual. The family likely operated like a rotating military unit, strict schedules for feeding, cleaning, watch duty and sleep, with clear allocation of responsibilities. Routine is the human technology of endurance. This human order is visible in the narrative's emphasis on Noah's role. He is not merely a passenger, he is commander and caretaker. The text's theological center, God shutting the door, intersects with the physical problem of sealing a large ramp against violent seas. A wide ramp or door is structurally vulnerable. In open seas, a human closed hatch risks catastrophic failure under wave pressure, both in sealing efficacy and in the structural stress imparted to the hull. The biblical claim that God closes the door is both theological and coherent with engineering difficulty. It indicates that at a decisive moment, God effected a seal beyond human capacity, thus removing a critical vulnerability. This reading preserves the miraculous core without dispensing with the need for human labor and smart design. The Ark's most dramatic technical trial arrives at the point when the door is sealed. From a risk perspective, sealing converts a ventilated system into a constrained, self-contained biosphere. Heat, humidity, and exhaled gases become concentrated. Prior measures, passive ventilation through SAW, compartmentalization via kinim, low center of gravity from living ballast and slatted floors for waste, are stress-tested to their limits. The greatest hazards converge: an ignition source, a methane-rich pocket, or a sustained bacterial bloom could push the Ark past recovery. The narrative's tension is understandable. The Ark is simultaneously protected and precarious. The plausibility of survival depends on the interaction of preemptive design and disciplined maintenance, plus that decisive theological act that closes the door and, by faith, opens the way to deliverance. When waters finally subside, the Ark runs aground on the mountains of Ararat. Landing introduces a new kind of test. A flat-bottomed hull, again consistent with the block-like proportions, gives the vessel the advantage of sitting relatively stably on uneven, rocky substrate. Unlike a ship with a deep keel, a flat base spreads weight, reducing the risk that a single rock punctures the hull. But sudden contact against a rock face brings friction, vibration, and a new stress regime: plank compression, local crushing, and the need to support increased localized loads. That the Ark survives landing without catastrophic splitting tells us either that the hull's construction was robust, heavy timbers, strong crossbeams, and well-secured decks, or that the text wants to highlight divine preservation at the moment when human engineering runs out of margin. The two are complementary. Wooden craft can rest on rock if the loads are distributed, and if the hull's structural continuity is preserved. The Ark's decks, tied into its beams likely contributed to its ability to hold together. Finally comes the sensory aftermath. After months in dim, tar-scented confinement, the opening of the door and the first light flood the interior with overwhelming brightness. Sounds that had been choked and compressed now explode into a new acoustic space. Animals and humans alike experience a kind of shock, both terrifying and liberating. Pathways of smell and sight, dulled by months of survival work, suddenly expand. Bodies that have been rationed and immobile reinitiate normal behaviors. This is the narrative's catharsis. A world recreated, a test survived. The Ark's design choices, proportions that favored stability over seaworthiness, internal decks that tied the hull together, kinim that minimized bodily collisions and lowered metabolism, a saw that enabled passive ventilation, living ballast that stabilized the roll, gravity-fed stores, slatted sanitation, and a roof that collected rain, combine into a coherent picture of practical engineering serving an extraordinary event. As we assemble these pieces, two truths stand out. First, the biblical account includes technical hints that reward reading the text with an eye for design. A single Hebrew word like kinim points to an interior strategy. A measured set of dimensions suggests a deliberate form. Second, engineering and faith are not opposites in this narrative. They are partners. The Ark is neither merely a miracle in which human effort played no part, nor a triumph of carpentry alone. Instead, it is a convergence. Careful planning, carpentry skill, biological management, and discipline created a system that God could preserve and employ. The theological claim, God closed the door and ensured survival, is not undermined by pointing to practical means. On the contrary, it makes the story richer, divine sovereignty working through human responsibility and well-applied wisdom. What remains striking and yes, shocking is how much the text gives us to work with. Small details that might be dismissed as incidental become design cues. 3 decks as structural ties, kinim as compartmentalization, soar as a venting opening, and pitch as both protector and sensory modifier. Each plays a role in a larger survival algorithm that balances moisture control, air exchange, weight distribution, waste removal, food and water logistics, and human psychology. There are limits to what can be asserted. We cannot, from the text alone, specify exact animal counts, derive a comprehensive maintenance manual, or claim that every technical question has a single correct answer. But we can say, plausibly and with technical humility, that the story anticipates many of the challenges a floating menagerie would present, and that the proposed design, simple, passive, and disciplined, addresses them in coherent ways. The Ark, read through a blend of textual care and engineering logic, looks less like a naively constructed boat and more like a conservative, robust survival platform optimized for endurance over maneuver. That dual insight frames a practical spiritual takeaway. Faith does not absolve work, it commends it. Noah's obedience is not accidental to survival, it is fundamental. Obedience, preparation, and skilled labor are the human forms of faith in this account. God calls, Noah builds, and the work itself becomes an instrument of preservation. The narrative invites us to see divine providence, not as a bypass of human responsibility, but as a partnership where human wisdom and effort are the vessels by which grace travels. If you want to explore this reconstruction visually, to see models that map the decks, kinim, saw, and the gravity-fed systems we've described, subscribe and watch our companion video, where we unpack a detailed plan and 3D model of these hypotheses. The Ark, it turns out, was more than a story about survival. It was a lesson in designing hope.